Hello. I wanted to record a few thoughts following my recent workshop at Treadwell's Books. So this was a workshop on queering magic. So it was queer magic we were interested in exploring that day. We spent the morning kind of establishing rapport within the group and then unpacking what the word queer meant to us in that setting at that time. So things like fluidity, multiplicity, non-hierarchical, rhizomatic kind of structure, ideas of identity and things like gender and sexuality, images like water and like spirals all kind of came out. And then we used that material to build a set of practices over the afternoon. So, for example, we had at the beginning a process of welcoming in all of our kind of queer ancestors and queer spirits to help support us. And we had a meditative practice. Then we did a practice involving kind of glossolalia and shaking trance. And then that kind of moved towards an opportunity for us collectively to approach what in the ritual we called the Cauldron of the Queer. So this was a physical cauldron with black water inside it where people could come and listen or speak or in some other way interact with this thing, which in the ritual context was seen as the wellspring, the well that never runs dry of this kind of queer, mutating, morphing possibility. And a number of things kind of came out from the workshop. One was a spontaneously arising process where we all went outside the room we were working in and we left offerings on a fireplace. And this is a fireplace in Treadwell's Books, which has been brought from the North Cornish town of Bude to Treadwell's, because it's the fireplace which was in the home of a person called Pamela Coleman Smith. Pamela Coleman Smith was an artist, an initiate of the Golden Dawn, the publisher of a number of the Anansi stories, or the writer of a number of the Anansi stories. Really, really kind of significant character, particularly because it's her designs for the minor arcana cards, which inform many, many, many other tarot decks. So she's the kind of godmother of the modern tarot, one might say. So we left kind of offerings to her, and that was something that kind of came out from the discussions and from the workshop we were doing. There were other kind of insights looking at things like queer deities and queer spirits in particular. And it's often remarked on, but it's worth, again, reiterating that it's very interesting that the gods of magic and the gods of queer are often one and the same. So even with quite potentially heteronormative looking all-father figures like Odin, in his journey to get access to the women's magic of transmediumship, let's call it, where he has to give up his eye, that gives him this kind of queer quality, which is remarked on in some of the texts and certainly in more contemporary writing about him. If you look at characters like Pan or Mercury, Hermes, again you find this kind of bisexuality, fluidity, gender uncertainty, and a lot of other qualities that the queer kind of relates to. So as well as the queer being about the liminal, it's also about like the tricky in some respects, and this idea of like disruption and the ability to radically shift and to change things is part of, I think, what the queer is about. So on the simplest level, in terms of gender identity, the concept of queer and queering allows us to take something like the notion of men and women, these two apparently watertight compartments in culture, and the queer kind of gets in there like a fluid between the gaps and breaks down this and demonstrates that this apparently simple binary opposition is actually open to fluidity and change and multiplicity and so on. And the gods of magic are very much like this as well. They have this tricky kind of quality. They're very often the gods of lying, deceit, thievery, as well as being, deities of writing and language. And again, writing and language are kind of like this. They're tricky things in a variety of senses. On the one hand, what words do, like men and women, is they define and they make intelligible, and they give us the ability to kind of communicate over stuff in a a pragmatic or a transactional kind of a way. But we also know that any word that's attached to things, although it may have a historical process that arises into that word, the word itself is often sort of fairly arbitrary. It may have originally been onomatopoeic or musical, perhaps in the way that language might have developed from singing. But the word sound can be very, very different in various different languages, can refer to still the same kind of object. So there's a slippery nature there. There's also the way that language itself changes over time. So words are quite capable of entirely reversing their meaning and entirely changing what the kind of message that they carry in particular contexts. And so again, like the notion of the queer, there's this idea of the transformation and the possibility of change and the possibility of fluidity and movement away from rigid structures. One might argue that magic itself is very queer. And what I mean by that is that when we go into a magical process, we're usually doing some kind of process where we change our consciousness, we change our state of awareness in some way. And very often the outcome that we're looking for is some sort of change of perspective or the acquisition of a new insight or ability. Now, what's strange and interesting about this, and what's kind of paradoxical about this, is that the act of deploying a piece of magical technology queers the very self that goes into the ritual. So I'll give you a simple example. A simple example of that would be that I might decide to do a piece of holotropic breath work. I might have a particular intention for that holotropic breathwork or that connected breathwork. So I'm going to do over breathing, and maybe I build that into an elaborate ritual. Maybe I don't. Either way, it's a magical process in as much as I'm actively using my imagination and a set of skills in order to make a transformation. Now, the self that pops out of the breathwork an hour and 10 or 3 hours later, or however long you do it for, that self can be very different to the self that intended to go into the breathwork. It can be usually a matter of a slight shift, but it can be kind of a radical resettling and re-understanding of the self, particularly if that ritual is a kind of an initiatory ritual or a ritual that for whatever reason has a remarkable transformative effect. So the ability to transform the self using these kind of techniques is it's like a kind of bootstrapping process. It's sometimes called an autopoietic process. So this is the idea of self-creation. And that self-creation, of course, implies the breaking down of previous structure. So my colleague and friend Steve D talks about magic as being a way of stirring the cauldron of the unconscious mind, so perhaps the cauldron of the queer. And what it does is it throws up then these new things into awareness, which can unpick conceptual structures in order to allow new forms of truth, new multiplicities and new perspectives to arise. And so I think that one of the things that really was, I was really reminded of by that workshop and really kind of holds true for me, is that in many respects, magic itself can be thought of as something that is deeply, profoundly queer. Thanks for listening.